Imagine for a moment that you are a county clerk.
Okay, right.
Yeah. So your entire job, like the way you actually feed your family, it involves processing paperwork for the local government.
Just everyday bureaucratic stuff.
Exactly. And one of those pieces of paper, just happens to be a marriage license.
Right.
Now, imagine a monumental shift in the law happens, like practically overnight. Let's say the Supreme Court legalizes same-sex marriage nationwide.
Which obviously really did happen.
Right, it did. But you, as this clerk, based on the deepest, most foundational tenets of your personal religious faith, you believe that issuing a license to a same-sex couple is a profound moral sin.
Wow, yeah, so you were in a massive bind.
You really are, because on the other side of the counter is a couple who has fought for, decades, for the simple, dignified right to be recognized equally under the law.
And they're looking right at you.
Yeah, they're looking at you to hand them that piece of paper.
It's just, well, it is the ultimate immovable object meeting an unstoppable force.
Totally.
You basically have two fundamental American ideals here. The right to practice your religion freely and the right to exist in society as an equal citizen.
Right.
And they are crashing head on at like a linoleum counter in a municipal building.
And it's wild because people on both sides of that counter feel this existential level of threat.
Well, absolutely.
People on the political left, they view the clerk's refusal as this devastating discrimination, right? A total denial of basic humanity.
Yeah, and then meanwhile, people on the political right view forcing that clerk to sign the paper as a devastating violation of religious freedom.
Like an act of state tyranny crushing individual conscience.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And that tension, it isn't just theoretical. It is tearing at the social fabric of communities right now.
Everywhere.
Yeah, it's playing out in bakeries, photography studios, hospitals, and government offices across the entire country.
Which honestly brings us to the mission of today's deep dive, because we are going to explore this highly detailed scholarly framework that actually attempts to solve these exact collisions.
It's a really fascinating approach.
It is. It's based on a book by a legal scholar named Nelson Tebbe, and it's called Religious Freedom in an Egalitarian Age.
But before we even take one step further into this legal minefield.
Yeah, we really need to pause here and make something explicitly clear to you, the listener.
Very, very clear.
Yeah.
Because we are stepping into an incredibly volatile arena today.
We are. We are going to be discussing viewpoints from both the political left and the political right.
Really highly charged issues.
Yeah, stuff involving abortion, same-sex marriage, religious exemptions for businesses.
The biggest cultural flashpoints.
Exactly. And we want you to know, definitively, we are absolutely not taking sides today.
Not at all.
We are not endorsing the progressive arguments, and we are not endorsing the conservative arguments.
Right. Our only job as your guides today is to impartially report, decode, and convey the ideas contained in this specific source material.
We just want you to fully grasp the scholarly framework presented by the author so you can evaluate it for yourself.
Nothing more, nothing less. We are just here to map the territory, not to claim it.
Perfectly said.
And to navigate this map, we're going to follow a very specific trajectory today.
Give us the blueprint.
So first, we'll start by looking at the method. Like how we even begin to reason through these seemingly impossible conflicts using this concept called social coherence.
Social coherence, got it.
Right. And from there, we'll unpack 4 specific legal principles that the author believes can act as guardrails.
Like boundaries for the debate.
Exactly. And then finally, we'll take those pristine, abstract principles and just kind of drag them down into the messy reality of the world.
Put them to the test.
Yeah, test them against real flashpoints. Those wedding vendors, employment disputes, massive government funding battles.
Okay, let's unpack this. Let's start with why this feels so incredibly acute right now.
It really does feel like it's boiling over.
Right, because, religious freedom isn't a new concept in America.
Definitely not.
And neither is equality. So why does it feel like the temperature in the room has just, suddenly skyrocketed over the last decade or two?
Well, the source text actually isolates 2 massive tectonic shifts in the legal landscape that have acted as catalysts for this.
Okay, what's the first one?
The first, and perhaps most visible, is the incredibly rapid and successful mobilization for LGBTQ rights.
Right.
If you look at the historical timeline, The shift in public opinion and legal recognition, culminating most famously in Obergefell v. Hodges, which guaranteed marriage equality nationwide, it happened at a speed that's almost unprecedented in constitutional history.
It really was breathtakingly fast from a legal perspective.
It was. So suddenly, sexual orientation and gender identity were receiving these robust protections that simply didn't exist in the same way, a generation prior.
And this rapid expansion of equality law naturally pressed right up against institutions and individuals who hold traditional religious views on marriage and sexuality, right?
Exactly.
It effectively shrank the space where those traditional views held legal primacy.
Precisely. And then the second major catalyst involves health law and women's equality.
Okay.
The author points specifically to the Obama administration's policy decisions regarding reproductive freedom. And the flashpoint everyone remembers there is the Affordable Care Act's contraception mandate.
Oh, yeah, where the federal government essentially said, if you are an employer providing health insurance, that plan absolutely must cover female contraception.
Yes. And that mandate collided directly with corporate employers like, the Green family who owns Hobby Lobby.
Right, because they objected to covering certain types of contraception on deep religious grounds.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So you have these two massive waves.
The expansion of LGBTQ rights and the tightening of reproductive health care mandates.
Yeah. And they're just crashing simultaneously onto the shores of traditional religious practice.
And reading through the source material, what really strikes me is the psychological impact this has had on religious traditionalists.
It's mad.
The author describes this fascinating inversion of minority status. Like, for a huge chunk of American history, if you held traditional mainstream Christian views, you were aligned with the cultural and legal majority.
Right. You essentially wrote the laws.
Exactly. But now, with these rapid egalitarian shifts, many religious traditionalists feel that they have become the persecuted minority.
That's a huge shift in identity.
Yeah, they feel they are the ones who desperately need the courts to protect them from this overwhelming state-mandated liberal orthodoxy.
And that feeling of cultural displacement is profound. And it has given rise to a very specific, very cynical academic response that Tebbe spends a lot of time addressing.
Okay, what does he call them?
He calls them the skeptics.
Skeptics. Now, these aren't just like internet trolls, right?
No, we're talking about serious legal scholars.
Yeah.
Mostly conservative, but surprisingly some progressives too.
Really?
Yeah, and they look at this entire legal battlefield and essentially just throw their hands in the air.
What's their actual argument, though?
They look at the current state of religious freedom jurisprudence. How the Supreme Court decides who gets an exemption and who doesn't. And they declare the whole enterprise hopelessly incoherent.
Just a mess.
A total mess. The skeptics argue that modern democracy has completely severed itself from the original theological justifications for religious freedom.
Okay, wait, let me make sure I follow that.
Sure.
Are they saying that hundreds of years ago, when the founders were writing about religious liberty, they were operating in a society that broadly agreed on certain fundamental theological truths?
Yes, exactly.
Like, God exists and God requires us to follow our conscience, therefore the state shouldn't interfere.
That is exactly their premise. The historical argument is that religious freedom made logical sense when society had a shared religious baseline.
Right, a common language.
But today, in a pluralistic, highly secularized democracy, we just don't have that shared theological foundation anymore.
We don't agree on the basics.
Right. So the skeptics argue that when modern judges try to decide these cases, they have no real constitutional anchor.
They're just adrift.
Yeah, they are just making arbitrary, conclusory decisions based on their own gut feelings or political biases.
And the text uses a really great legal term for this, an ipse dixit.
Ah, yes.
Which basically translates from Latin to he himself said it.
Yes, it's a dogmatic statement resting entirely on the authority of the person saying it.
It's the legal equivalent of being a kid and asking your parents, why do I have to go to bed at 8 p.m.?
And they look at you and say,
because I said so.
Exactly.
There's no deeper logic. There's no reasoned argument about sleep cycles and brain development. It's just raw authority.
Yep.
So the skeptics are accusing the Supreme Court of essentially playing the because I said so parent when it comes to religious freedom cases.
That is a perfect translation of the skeptic critique.
Wow.
And their proposed solution is pretty radical.
What is it?
Because they believe judicial reasoning in this area is just a facade, they argue we should strip these issues away from judges entirely.
Take the courts out of it.
Yeah. Take it out of the courts. and throw it to the legislatures. Let the messy, bare-knuckle political process sort it out.
Oh, wow.
Let the voters and the politicians fight it out state by state because, well, at least politicians can be voted out of office.
But hold on. If we accept the skeptic's premise, that's incredibly bleak.
It is very bleak.
If constitutional law is just a facade for a raw power grab, then our fundamental rights just depend on whoever happens to have 51% of the vote on any given Tuesday.
Right. It's just pure majority rule.
Yeah, so if you're in the minority, whether you're a religious traditionalist in a liberal state or a gay couple in a conservative state, you're just out of luck.
Completely unprotected.
There has to be a way to actually reason through these conflicts without turning civil rights into a political cage match. Right.
And Tebbe entirely agrees with your hesitation there. He wholly rejects the skeptic's cynicism, and that rejection forms the entire foundation of his framework.
Okay, so how does he counter it?
He argues that we actually can reason through these problems, but to do so, we need a specific intellectual method.
And this is the social coherence thing.
Yes, he calls this method social coherence.
The source text roots this heavily in the work of the legendary political philosopher John Rawls, right?
It does, yes.
Specifically, a concept Rawls called reflective equilibrium, which sounds, frankly, terrifyingly academic.
It sounds intimidating, I know, but the mechanics are actually quite intuitive.
Okay, lay it out for us.
Think about it like this. When we as a society face a brand new, thorny moral problem, let's stick with the wedding photographer who refuses to shoot a same-sex wedding.
Good example.
We don't just guess at the answer. And we don't just invent a brand new rule out of thin air. Instead, we look at the judgments and precedents we already deeply trust.
So we look at the legal bedrock we've already settled on over the years.
Correct. We look at past cases that society broadly agrees were decided correctly. We look at abstract principles we claim to hold dear, like equal protection or freedom of speech.
Right.
And then we test our new problem against those old trusted rules, working back and forth until everything aligns.
It makes me think of tuning an instrument while you're sitting in the middle of a symphony orchestra.
Oh, that's a great way to put it.
Like, if you are the oboe player, you don't go sit in a soundproof, vacuum-sealed room with a digital tuner to find some perfect, abstract, ontological pitch, right?
No, you're part of the whole group.
Yeah, you are sitting on stage and you are tuning your instrument to the other players around you. That's the social aspect.
Exactly.
You listen to the strings, you listen to the brass, and you adjust your own pitch so that the entire chord makes sense together.
Right, it's relational.
Because if you play a note and it creates this horrible, dissonant clash with the rest of the orchestra, you don't just say, well, my digital tuner said I was right.
You get fired.
Yeah, you have to adjust to find harmony with the established music.
That analogy perfectly captures the spirit of Rawlsian reflective equilibrium.
Yeah.
We are trying to find legal harmony.
Okay.
And the author lays out 7 very specific clarifications for how this tuning process, this method of coherence, actually operates in constitutional law.
I think we should explore these because they really explain how we avoid the skeptic's trap.
Let's do it.
Let's run through them. The first clarification the text offers is that coherence requires more than just simple consistency. It needs mutual support.
Right. It's not enough to just say, well, law A doesn't physically contradict law B.
Okay.
Your legal judgments need to actively reinforce each other.
Give me an example.
Well, the logic you use to solve the wedding photographer case should conceptually support the logic you use to solve a case about a doctor refusing to perform a procedure.
So they can't just be randomly tolerated, they have to interlock.
Yes, the ideas have to interlock and hold each other up.
Which leads to the second clarification, and I think this one is crucial for dealing with those skeptics.
What is it?
This method is about justification, not absolute ontological truth.
Yes, that is a huge point.
Let's break that down for the listener, because ontological truth is one of those phrases that definitely makes people's eyes glaze over.
I don't blame them. Ontological truth refers to the fundamental nature of reality, like the absolute universe-ordained right answer with a capital R and a capital A.
The divine truth.
Right. Now, the skeptics say, because we can't agree on the capital T truth about God or morality, we can't have law.
Okay, and coherence says?
Coherence says, we don't need to agree on the ultimate truth of the universe to run a functioning society.
We just need to figure out how to live together.
Exactly. We just need good, justifiable reasons for our legal conclusions. We are proving that our decision is warranted by the rest of the legal system we built, rather than just acting on bias.
So we aren't trying to prove what God thinks about marriage. We are just trying to prove what the American legal system demands based on its own internal logic.
Exactly. Which brings us to the third clarification.
Okay.
Everything is revisable.
Meaning no law, no precedent, no deeply held legal belief is totally immune to being challenged and changed.
Nothing is set in stone.
Okay.
Going back to your orchestra analogy, if you are tuning your instrument to the orchestra and you suddenly realize the entire string section is playing out of tune, you don't just blindly follow them.
Right.
If a new case comes along that forces society to realize an old precedent is fundamentally flawed or unjust, we can and should change the old precedent.
Like how Brown v. Board of Education forced the legal system to realize that the old precedent of separate but equal was this horrific dissonance that just had to be thrown out.
That is the perfect historical example.
The law has to be a living thing.
Yes. And the fourth clarification says this method operates at any level of abstraction.
Meaning it scales up and down.
It scales perfectly.
Yeah.
You can use social coherence to solve a highly specific ground-level dispute over whether a local bakery has to bake a specific cake.
Okay.
Or you can zoom way, way out and use it to debate high-level abstract principles like the fundamental meaning of the First Amendment itself.
So the method of working back and forth works up and down the whole ladder.
Exactly.
Okay, clarification 5. It is an ideal state we strive for, not a final destination.
Right. We will never achieve perfect reflective equilibrium. The orchestra will never be flawlessly in tune forever.
Why not?
Because society is too dynamic. New technologies, new social movements, new cultural understandings will constantly disrupt the harmony.
It's always a moving target.
Always. The value of the method isn't in reaching a utopia where all legal conflict ends. The value is in the continuous, reasoned striving to test and refine our laws.
Which naturally dispels a big criticism of this method, covered in clarification 6.
The conservative critique.
Yeah, that the method is not inherently conservative or backward-looking. And honestly, I can see why people might think that initially.
Sure.
If the method requires you to look at past precedents to solve new problems, doesn't that just trap us in the morality of the past?
It's a very common critique, but it's misplaced. Because of clarification 3, that everything is revisable, the method actually forces us to constantly critique our inherited laws.
Oh, I see.
When a new social movement, like the LGBTQ rights movement, brings forward new claims of equality, social coherence demands that we test our old inherited assumptions against these new insights.
So it's a mechanism for reasoned progress, not just this straitjacket of tradition.
Precisely.
And finally, clarification 7. This method is perfectly suited for constitutional law. The text brings in another heavy hitter here, the legal philosopher Ronald Dworkin,
Yes, Dworkin.
and his idea of fit and justification.
Dworkin argued that when judges interpret the Constitution, they are essentially doing social coherence. Well, a judge has to find a ruling that fits the established history and case law. They can't just completely ignore precedent.
Right, they can't just make it up.
But among the possible rulings that do fit, they must choose the one that provides the best moral justification for the law moving forward.
So they are balancing the past with the best vision of the future.
Exactly.
Okay, so we've spent a lot of time on the coherence part, tuning the instrument, finding the harmony. But the author explicitly calls his method social coherence.
Right.
Why put so much emphasis on the word social?
Because Tebbe is being brutally honest about human nature here.
Okay.
He fully admits that our legal reasoning does not happen in a sterile vacuum. It is shot through with political and cultural dynamics. We all argue from our specific social locations.
Meaning, like, my background, my religion, my race, my geographic location, all of that influences which precedents I instinctively trust and which principles I prioritize.
Yes. The social movements of our time shape our intuitions. Now, the skeptics look at that and say, aha, see, your reasoning is corrupted by your social bias, therefore it's all irrational power politics.
But Tebbe flips that on its head.
He does. He says that acknowledging our social locations doesn't make our reasoning irrational. It just means our initial intuitions are often incomplete.
So the social coherence is a demand for, like, self-interrogation.
Exactly.
It forces a judge or a voter to pause and ask, am I deciding this wedding vendor case this way simply because I belong to a conservative church or because I live in a liberal city? Or can I actually justify this outcome using legal principles that apply equally to everyone?
It's a tool to overcome our tribal impulses. It demands that we bring our unarticulated biases into the light and subject them to reasoned debate.
All right, I feel like we've thoroughly set the stage.
The orchestra is seated.
Yeah, exactly. We've got our tuning method. We know how to test for harmony. But a method is just a process. To actually play the symphony, you need sheet music.
You need actual notes.
Yeah. Right. So what are the core legal principles we are tuning our instruments to?
Okay, so armed with the method of social coherence, the text identifies 4 specific legal pillars that have deep, deep roots in American jurisprudence.
Let's go through them.
These are the principles that can mediate those brutal conflicts between religion and equality. And the first one is arguably the most dominant in the book.
Which is
The principle of avoiding harm to others.
also referred to as the rule against shifting burdens.
Yes.
And the text points out that this isn't some new progressive invention cooked up in the 21st century. The roots of this go all the way back to the Founding Fathers.
The historical baseline here is remarkably strong.
Yeah.
If you read the framers of the Constitution, particularly figures like James Madison and Thomas Jefferson, they absolutely despise the idea of state-mandated religion.
Right.
But specifically, they despise taxes that supported established religions.
I remember that quote from the book. Jefferson famously argued that to compel a man to furnish contributions of money for the propagation of opinions which he disbelieves is sinful and tyrannical.
Exactly. The classic phrasing is that it's tyrannical to pick Thomas Jefferson's pocket to fund someone else's church.
Right. So the government cannot impose the financial or material cost of your faith onto a citizen who doesn't share it.
Exactly. So how does that translate into a modern constitutional rule?
How does it?
The core principle is this. The government is perfectly allowed, and in many cases actively encouraged, to lift a legal burden on a religious person to help them practice their faith.
Okay, that makes sense.
However, the government cannot lift that burden if doing so shifts the cost of the accommodation onto a third-party private citizen.
Let's ground this with some case law. Give me a really clear example of the government lifting a burden where there is no cost shifted to a bystander.
Okay, the text highlights a Supreme Court case called Holt v. Hobbs.
Holt v. Hobbs, what happened there?
This involved a Muslim inmate in an Arkansas prison. His religious faith required him to grow a beard. But the prison had a strict grooming policy that banned all beards, ostensibly for security reasons.
Right. Pretty common policy.
Yeah, so the inmate asked for a religious accommodation to grow a half-inch beard.
And the Supreme Court ruled in his favor, right? They told the prison they had to accommodate him.
Yes.
So why does that fit this principle perfectly?
Because the accommodation was essentially cost-free to everyone else.
Oh, I see.
Allowing this specific inmate to grow a half-inch beard didn't threaten prison security. They couldn't prove a weapon could be hidden in a half-inch beard.
Right.
It didn't cost the state any money. But most crucially for our framework, it shifted exactly zero burden onto the other inmates or the prison guards.
No third party was harmed by allowing him to practice his faith.
Not at all.
It goes back to the dinner party analogy.
Oh, the dinner party. I love this one.
Yeah, like if I go to a dinner party and I have a strict religious diet, it is completely fine for me to ask the host, hey, could I just have a plain salad instead of the main course?
Right. That's lifting a burden. It costs nothing.
But it becomes a massive constitutional problem if the government steps in and forces the other guests at the dinner table to empty their wallets to pay for a special, highly expensive meal just for me.
Exactly. You cannot draft innocent bystanders into subsidizing my religious exercise.
That analogy perfectly sets up the author's critique of one of the most explosive Supreme Court cases of the modern era.
Yes. Burwell v. Hobby Lobby.
Okay, let's dive deep into this one because this is where the theory hits the political buzzsaw.
It really does.
We mentioned it earlier. This was the battle over the Affordable Care Act's contraception mandate. Walk us through the mechanics of what actually happened here.
Under the ACA, Congress decided that to promote public health and gender equality, employer-provided health insurance plans had to cover a range of preventative services.
Including female contraception.
Right. Including female contraception without any cost-sharing or copays.
Meaning the employee shouldn't have to pay out of pocket at the pharmacy. The insurance plan covers it completely.
Right. Now, Hobby Lobby is a massive for-profit arts and crafts chain with thousands of employees. But it is closely held and owned by the Green family, who were devout Christians.
Right.
They argued that providing insurance coverage for certain types of contraception specifically intrauterine devices, or IUDs, and morning-after pills, which they equated to abortion, violated their deeply held religious beliefs.
So they sued the federal government, demanding a religious exemption from the mandate.
And in a landmark 5-4 decision, the Supreme Court sided with Hobby Lobby. They granted the corporation the religious exemption.
But the author of our source text, using this principle of avoiding harm to others, argues that this ruling was a profound failure of constitutional logic.
He does.
Walk me through the critique.
The critique hinges entirely on who pays the bill. By granting Hobby Lobby the exemption, the Supreme Court lifted a burden on the religious employers. But the cost of that accommodation did not magically disappear.
Right, the contraception still costs money.
Exactly. The government didn't step in and say, okay, we will pay for the contraception directly, and Hobby Lobby certainly wasn't paying for it.
So the cost fell squarely on the female employees.
Exactly. The cost was shifted directly onto the private citizens working at the company. And it was a substantial cost. Both the literal financial burden of buying expensive contraception like IUDs out of pocket, and the broader health and autonomy costs associated with restricted access to reproductive care.
The female employees were the other guests at the dinner party being forced to pay the tab for their boss's religious beliefs.
Perfectly stated.
And they might not even share those beliefs. You could have an employee who relies on that medication for medical reasons having nothing to do with preventing pregnancy, and suddenly she's footing the bill so her employer's conscience can remain clear.
Which creates a fascinating and heated debate about how we define and measure harm.
Because defenders of the Hobby Lobby decision push back hard here, don't they?
Oh, very hard. They argue that forcing the Green family to violate their religious convictions by providing the coverage is also a severe harm.
Right.
They feel their religious liberty is being crushed by the state.
That's a fair point, to be honest. If the government forces you to violate your deepest moral code under threat of massive financial penalties, that is absolutely a burden.
It is.
So how does the social coherence framework resolve that standoff where both sides claim they are being harmed?
The framework argues that in a constitutional democracy, these harms are not legally symmetrical.
What do you mean by that?
Well, the government burdens private citizens all the time. We are burdened by taxes, by jury duty, by environmental regulations, by labor laws.
True.
That is the baseline cost of participating in civil society and operating a business in the public marketplace.
Right.
But there is a fundamental difference between the government burdening you with a general law and the government granting an exemption that forces a private third party to bear the cost of your specific religion.
So the question becomes, how much shifted burden is too much? Like, if a burden is truly microscopic, does it still violate the Constitution?
The text explores two legal standards for measuring this.
Right.
One is the materiality standard, proposed by legal scholar Frederick Geddix. He suggests drawing from tort law. Basically, is the shifted harm significant enough that a reasonable person would care about it?
So if it's a penny, maybe not.
Right. But if it's hundreds of dollars for medical care, absolutely.
But the author actually pushes for a different standard drawn from employment law, right?
Yes. Tebby points to the undue hardship standard found in Title VII of the Civil Rights Act.
Okay.
His argument is that if a religious accommodation imposes anything more than a de minimis, a minimal, almost unnoticeable cost on a third party, it crosses the line into unconstitutionality.
So the government simply cannot redistribute the costs of religious adherence onto the shoulders of employees or customers.
Never.
If we step back and look at the big picture of Principle 1, what it's really doing is guarding the equal citizenship of the bystanders.
Exactly.
It ensures that the state isn't creating a hierarchy where religious believers are treated like a privileged class who get to extract a tax, whether in money, time, or dignity, from everyone else just to practice their faith.
That is precisely the author's point. It protects egalitarianism at the most material level.
Okay, that brings us to Principle 2, fairness to others.
Right.
If Principle 1 is about not hurting innocent bystanders, Principle 2 is about not leaving comparable secular citizens out in the cold.
Yes.
It's about who gets to sit at the table in the first place.
Right. If the government decides it is going to grant an exemption for a deeply held belief, it has to be fair about how it defines that belief.
It can't play favorites.
Exactly. It cannot play favorites. And the defining historical examples the text uses to illustrate this are the Vietnam-era draft objector cases.
Okay, I don't know much about those.
Specifically, United States v. Seeger and Welsh v. United States.
These cases are fascinating. Paint the picture of what was happening during the draft.
Okay, so during the Vietnam War, the military draft was in full effect.
Right.
But Congress, recognizing the history of religious pacifism in America, wrote a conscientious objector exemption into the law.
Okay.
If your religion, specifically defined by belief in a supreme being, forbade you from participating in war in any form, you were exempt from combat. Think of Quakers or certain Mennonite groups.
So the government lifts the burden of the draft because it conflicts with their religious obligations.
Exactly. But then you had men like Daniel Seeger.
Who was he?
Seeger was drafted, and he claimed conscientious objector status. The problem was, Seeger was not a traditional religious believer.
Oh.
He didn't believe in a traditional God. However, he had an incredibly deep, rigorous philosophical and moral objection to war.
So he was a secular pacifist.
Yes, whose beliefs were just as profound and guided his life just as strictly as a devout Quaker's beliefs.
But initially, under the strict wording of the statute, the draft board denied his exemption because his pacifism wasn't quote-unquote religious.
Right, and the Supreme Court recognized a massive constitutional problem with that.
Which was?
To draft Daniel Seeger and send him to Vietnam while exempting a traditional religious pacifist would be a blatant violation of fairness to others.
It would mean the government is placing a premium on theological beliefs while entirely discounting deeply held secular morality.
Exactly. It essentially tells the secular citizen, your conscience doesn't matter to the state. Only religious consciences count.
Wow. So how did the Supreme Court fix it?
Well, to avoid striking down the draft exemption entirely, the court engaged in a very creative piece of statutory interpretation.
What did they do?
They essentially expanded the definition of religion in those draft statutes.
Oh, interesting.
They ruled that a deeply held moral or ethical belief that occupies the same place in the life of the objector as an orthodox belief in God occupies in the life of a traditional believer qualifies for the exemption.
So they leveled the playing field.
They did.
The tax brings up another great example of this fairness principle regarding taxes. A case called Texas Monthly v. Bullock.
Yes. This is a perfect illustration of the limits of government favoritism.
Okay.
The state of Texas passed a law that granted a sales tax exemption, but they wrote it incredibly narrowly. It only applied to religious publications, so Bibles, church newsletters, religious tracts.
So if I publish a church bulletin, I don't pay the tax. But if I publish a secular political magazine or a scientific journal, I do pay the tax.
Precisely. And the Supreme Court struck the Texas law down.
And the reasoning was rooted deeply in the idea of equal citizenship, right?
Yes. The court argued that by giving a financial benefit exclusively to religious actors, the state was sending a clear, unmistakable message that secular citizens and secular organizations were, to quote the court, less than full members of the community.
It was a state-sponsored hierarchy of value.
Exactly.
So if a state finds itself in a situation where they've created an unfair exemption, say they accidentally granted a benefit only to religious groups, how does the social coherence framework say they must fix it?
The government is faced with a strict binary choice here.
Okay.
They have two options to restore constitutional harmony. Option one is they must level up.
What does that mean?
That means they expand the exemption to include everyone, religious or secular, who shares the comparable deep belief or engages in the comparable activity.
Like the Supreme Court did in the draft cases, they leveled up by expanding the definition to include secular pacifists.
Right. And option two is they must level down.
Which is what?
That means they repeal the exemption entirely, taking it away from both the religious and secular actors, returning everyone to an equal, unaccommodated baseline.
Got it.
What the state absolutely cannot do is maintain a status quo that legally favors the religious citizen over the secular citizen.
Wow. Okay, so principles 1 and 2, avoiding harm and fairness, they really focus on individuals and commercial businesses.
You do.
But what about groups? Because a church is not just a collection of individuals, it's an institution.
Right.
And an egalitarian society has to figure out how to handle religious institutions that operate by very different rules than the rest of the public.
Definitely.
This brings us to principle 3, freedom of association.
This is a crucial pivot in the book. You cannot treat a religious congregation the same way you treat a hardware store.
Okay, that's fair.
The core legal concept that governs this is called the ministerial exception, and the text relies heavily on a unanimous blockbuster Supreme Court case called Hosanna Tabor.
Break down Hosanna Tabor for us. What was at stake?
Well, Hosanna Tabor involved a teacher at a religious school who was fired and subsequently sued for discrimination under the Americans with Disabilities Act.
Okay.
Now, the specifics of her claim aren't as important as the broader legal doctrine the court affirmed.
What was the doctrine?
The Supreme Court ruled that the government, through its employment discrimination laws, has absolutely no authority to dictate who a religious organization chooses as its ministers.
Okay, the most obvious example of this is the Catholic Church.
Yes, perfectly clear example.
Because Title VII of the Civil Rights Act strictly prohibits employers from discriminating based on sex. If a secular Fortune 500 company flat out refused to hire female executives, they would be sued into oblivion immediately.
Absolutely.
But the Roman Catholic Church has an absolute constitutionally protected right to hire only men as priests.
Exactly. Why? Because the Constitution guarantees religious groups the freedom to select their own leaders, define their own doctrine, and shape their own internal community without state interference.
If the state could force a church to ordain someone contrary to its theology, the state would effectively be defining the religion.
Exactly, which is a huge First Amendment violation.
Okay, that makes perfect sense for a priest or a rabbi. But the really difficult legal question is, where does that immunity end?
That is the million-dollar question.
Right, because if a church runs a massive hospital system, can they fire a nurse for being gay? Can a religious school fire a janitor for their religious beliefs?
Exactly.
How far out from the altar does the freedom to discriminate extend?
This is where Tivi's framework gets really nuanced. He insists that we cannot just lump all groups together under one umbrella. To find social coherence, we have to disaggregate them.
Break them apart.
Right, we had to divide groups into 3 distinct tiers to determine how much freedom from civil rights laws they actually deserve.
Walk us through the 3 tiers. What is Tier 1?
Tier 1 consists of intimate associations. Think of families, marriages, and incredibly small, highly selective private clubs. These groups get massive, almost absolute protection from government interference in civil rights laws.
Wait, even if they are excluding people for terrible reasons?
Yes.
Wow.
Because these intimate, tight-knit bonds form our core personhood. The state have almost no business peering into your home and telling you who you are allowed to marry, or telling a deeply private, selective social club who they must invite into their living room.
The privacy interests at this level are paramount.
Exactly.
Okay, Tier 1 is highly protected. What is Tier 2?
Tier 2 involves community groups.
Okay.
This includes local church congregations, local civic clubs, maybe a neighborhood chapter of a larger fraternity. The text describes these as the incubators for interests and ideals.
Incubators, interesting.
They're the spaces where citizens gather locally to deliberate, share values, and form their identities away from the watchful eye of the state.
Because they serve this vital democratic function, they get strong protection.
They do, but it is not absolute like a family. Okay, what's the limit?
Well, a local church can absolutely restrict its clergy and its core leadership to its own members. But if that same local church decides to open a public-facing commercial bakery to raise funds, it might not be allowed to discriminate against customers in that bakery.
I see.
The protection starts to wane as the group faces outward into the public square.
Which leads us to Tier 3.
Right. Tier 3 is what the author calls values organizations, or bureaucratic expressive organizations.
They go big groups.
Yes, these are large, diffuse, often national entities. Think of a massive national religious hierarchy, a sprawling charity network, or a large political advocacy group.
So they don't have the tight, intimate, face-to-face bonds of a family or a local neighborhood parish.
Exactly. And because they lack that intimate cohesion, their right to exclude people is much narrower.
Okay.
They only get an exemption to discriminate in hiring if the specific employee's role is absolutely vital to the organization's core expressive message or theology. So an environmental advocacy group can absolutely refuse to hire a climate change denier as their lead spokesperson or chief lobbyist,
Right.
because that role is inextricably tied to their message. But they couldn't refuse to hire a receptionist based on their political views if the receptionist has zero input on the group's policies.
Right. The discrimination must be tightly demonstrably tethered to the core message.
Hold on, let me push back here using a famous case because this is where the framework gets really interesting.
Bring it on.
What about the Boy Scouts of America?
Yes.
In the case Boy Scouts of America v. Dale, the Supreme Court ruled that the Boy Scouts had a constitutional right to expel a gay scoutmaster because his presence supposedly violated the group's values.
Right.
Where do the Boy Scouts fit into these 3 tiers?
The author spends significant time analyzing the Boy Scouts case. Under his framework, The Boy Scouts of America is clearly a Tier 3 values organization.
Okay.
They are a massive, diffuse national bureaucracy with millions of members. They are not an intimate family, and they are not a tightly knit local parish.
So if they are a Tier 3 bureaucracy under the social coherence model, their right to discriminate shouldn't have been as broad as the Supreme Court allowed.
That is precisely the author's argument.
Oh, wow.
He suggests that because they're a diffuse organization, the court should have heavily scrutinized whether opposition to homosexuality was truly a core, defining, indispensable tenet of the Boy Scouts' expressive message.
Was it as central to their identity as an all-male priesthood is to the Catholic Church?
Exactly. And Tebbe suggests the answer is no, and that the court may have erred by giving a massive national bureaucracy the kind of deference that should be reserved for a small, intimate club.
That is a perfect example of how the method of social coherence forces us to test our precedents.
It does.
It asks, does the logic we use in the Boy Scouts case actually harmonize with the rules we've set for other large organizations?
And if it doesn't, we might need to revise our understanding of the precedent.
Okay, we've built 3 pillars: avoiding harm, fairness, and association. These first 3 principles all deal with what the government can do.
Right. It can't shift burdens. It can't play favorites. It can't interfere with core group structures.
But our final pillar, Principle 4, government non-endorsement, deals with something entirely different. It restricts what the government can say.
This is a vital concept in constitutional law. The government is not just a regulator that issues fines and grants licenses. It is also a speaker.
Right.
It possesses a massive, unavoidable megaphone. And the core rule of Principle 4 is this: the government cannot speak in a way that degrades the full and equal citizenship of its people.
To make this abstract concept concrete, the text uses some incredibly stark, visceral analogies.
It does, because we need to really understand expressive harm.
Let's hear one.
Okay, imagine you drive into a new town, and right at the city limits, there is a massive, taxpayer-funded billboard erected by the mayor that says, "This is a Christian town."
Wow.
Or, to use an even more extreme historical parallel, a sign that says, "This is a town for whites."
The moment you see that, the Constitution violation is obvious.
But why is it a violation? That's the important question.
Right.
Even if no one is physically assaulted because of the sign, even if a non-Christian or a non-white person is never denied a building permit, never arrested, never financially penalized by the town, the sign itself is a profound constitutional injury.
Because of the expressive harm.
Exactly. The government's speech, the expressive harm, renders non-Christians or non-whites as second-class, subordinated citizens.
Right.
The state is officially endorsing the message that certain people do not belong to the political community in the same way that the favored group belongs. It alters their fundamental standing.
And Tebbe takes this concept of expressive harm and applies it directly to the heart of the same-sex marriage debate,
He does.
explaining the deepest logic behind the Obergefell decision.
Yes. For a long time, the debate over same-sex marriage was framed entirely around legal benefits.
Right, hospital visitation, tax inheritance, property rights.
Exactly. And some states tried to compromise by offering civil unions, which provided all the exact same legal benefits as marriage, but reserved the specific word marriage for opposite-sex couples.
But the courts eventually realized that civil unions weren't enough. Why?
Because of Principle 4. Even if the tangible, material benefits were identical, creating a separate but equal status called civil unions sent a government-endorsed message of exclusion.
I see.
By reserving the culturally elevated term marriage only for heterosexuals, the state was telegraphing that same-sex relationships were fundamentally lesser, an imitation of the real thing.
It was a form of expressive degradation that violated their equal citizenship.
Exactly.
And the text notes this principle doesn't just apply to LGBTQ rights, it also limits how the state can talk about reproductive freedom.
Right. It places boundaries on anti-abortion advocacy by the state.
How so?
Well, while the government is allowed to express a preference for childbirth over abortion, it cannot use its massive megaphone to engage in speech that is so extreme, coercive, or shaming that it destroys the equal standing of women.
Oh, wow. Okay.
The government cannot speak in a way that telegraphs that women who exercise a fundamental liberty are somehow subordinate, immoral, or disfavored citizens. The state's ability to speak is always limited by the constitutional requirement to maintain equal citizenship for all.
We have spent a lot of time in the realm of high theory.
We have.
We've tuned our instruments with social coherence, and we have our 4 pillars of sheet music. Now it is time to play the music in the real world.
Time to apply it.
Yes, we are taking these pristine scholarly principles and throwing them into the absolute messiest, most emotionally fraught conflicts of our time.
Buckle up.
First stop, public accommodations. We're talking about businesses that open their doors to the general public.
These are the cases that dominate the evening news and social media feeds. The text highlights the primary contenders here.
Who are they?
You have Elaine Photography, the studio in New Mexico whose owners refused to photograph a same-sex commitment ceremony based on their religious beliefs.
Yep.
You have Arlene's Flowers, a nearly identical case involving a florist in Washington state. And you have the deeply agonizing cases of religiously affiliated adoption agencies refusing to place foster children with same-sex couples.
So let's put the method to the test. If I am a judge or a legislator trying to use social coherence to solve the wedding photographer case, where do I start?
You start by looking for analogies.
Right, because the method says I can't just invent an answer. I have to look for trusted precedents that already exist in our legal system and see which one fits the photographer best.
Exactly. And the author sets up what we can call a battle of analogies.
Battle of analogies, I like that.
There are two competing ways to view a commercial business refusing service on religious grounds. Let's call it Analogy A and Analogy B.
What's analogy A?
Analogy A is the medical conscience clause.
What is that?
Under both federal and state law, we have a long-standing tradition of allowing doctors and nurses to refuse to directly participate in specific medical procedures that they find morally or religiously objectionable.
Like, most notably, abortion.
Yes, abortion. We have crafted very specific laws that say, even though you serve the public as a medical professional, we will not force you to perform this specific, intimate act against your conscience.
So the religious traditionalist looks at the wedding photographer and says, this is analogy A. A wedding photographer is just like a doctor.
Right.
They are being asked to use their personal skills to participate in a specific event, a same-sex wedding that violates their core beliefs. We should have a refusal clause for the wedding vendor, just like we do for the doctor.
That is the argument for exemption. Now let's look at Analogy B.
Okay.
Analogy B is 1960s civil rights law.
Sure.
Think back to the classic transformative cases of the civil rights era. A restaurant owner, like in the famous Katzenbach v. McClung case, Ollie's Barbecue, or a motel operator, argues that their sincere religious beliefs forbid racial integration.
Right.
Therefore, they demand an exemption from the Civil Rights Act so they can refuse service to black customers.
And our society and the Supreme Court absolutely, unequivocally rejected that argument.
We did.
We laid down a marker. If you choose to open a commercial business in the public marketplace, you cannot turn away a customer based on their race. Full stop.
Right. So the egalitarian looks at the wedding photographer and says, this is Analogy B. A wedding photographer is just like a 1960s restaurant owner.
Okay.
They are a commercial entity participating in the public marketplace, and they cannot refuse service based on a customer's protected identity, whether that is race, religion, or sexual orientation.
So the judge has to weigh these two competing visions.
Right.
Which analogy is a better fit for Elaine photography? Is the photographer more like the dissenting doctor in an operating room, or more like the dissenting restaurant owner on Main Street?
The author, applying the principles of social coherence, concludes that Analogy B is the correct and legally justified one. The commercial photographer is much more akin to the restaurant owner.
Let's dig into why. Because if I am listening to this and I run a small creative business, I might be thinking, wait, why does the doctor get an out, but I don't? My photography is my art. It's personal.
It's a common objection.
Why does the medical analogy fail?
The author argues that medical refusal clauses are incredibly unique, narrow exceptions built around the concept of physical bodily autonomy.
Okay.
They involve a practitioner being asked to perform a physical medical procedure on another human body in a discrete, isolated clinical setting. It is an act of profound physical intimacy.
Whereas a public accommodation, like a photography studio, a bakery, a florist, is fundamentally different.
Yes. Public accommodations are the arteries of the broad public marketplace. A photography studio is engaged in routine, commercial, contractual transactions.
Right.
When you open a storefront, you are signaling to the public that you are open for business. If we allow religious exemptions for commercial businesses to start turning away gay customers, we undermine the entire architectural purpose of public accommodations law.
Which goes back to the idea of avoiding expressive harm.
Yeah.
The purpose of these laws isn't just to make sure people can buy a cake. It's to ensure that all citizens can participate freely in the public economy without the constant looming fear of public humiliation or exclusion.
That's it, exactly.
If a gay couple has to wonder every time they walk into a shop whether they're going to be turned away because of who they are, their equal citizenship is degraded.
Exactly. Just as we wouldn't grant a religious exemption for a business to turn away a black customer, or a divorced customer, or a Muslim customer. The method of coherence suggests we cannot grant one to turn away a gay customer.
Yeah.
The exemptions in the commercial marketplace must remain incredibly narrow to protect the egalitarian foundation of our society.
Let's keep pushing the boundaries.
Okay.
If the public marketplace is strict, is the workplace any different? We talked earlier about how the Catholic Church gets to hire only male priests. Does that leeway extend to other religious employers regarding LGBTQ discrimination?
Employment law is definitely a different arena. As we saw with the ministerial exception, the law does grant religious actors more breathing room to maintain their communities.
Right.
But the critical question is, how far should that breathing room extend when it clashes with new LGBTQ anti-discrimination laws?
How does the book explore this?
The text dives into a piece of legislation known as the Utah Compromise.
Oh, I remember when this happened. It was heralded as a major bipartisan breakthrough at the time. Walk us through the history of it.
Okay, so several years ago, the state of Utah, which is obviously heavily influenced by the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, passed a law that formally protected LGBTQ people from employment and housing discrimination.
Which was a massive historic step forward for equality in a conservative state.
It was.
But it was called a compromise for a reason. What did the religious traditionalists get in return?
They received sweeping categorical exemptions. The law essentially stated that religious organizations and their various affiliates and subsidiaries were completely exempt from these new LGBTQ discrimination rules.
Wow.
They were given a blanket pass to bypass the equality law.
And while politicians praised it as a pragmatic truce, the source text argues that constitutionally, under our principles, this compromise is deeply flawed. Why?
Tebbe argues it fails on multiple fronts. First, it violates Principle 2, fairness to others.
How so?
The state granted this massive exemption allowing discrimination to religious groups, but secular organizations with equally deep moral convictions didn't receive the same carve-out. It played favorites.
Okay, that makes sense.
Second, and more importantly, it violates Principle 1, avoiding harm.
Because it shifts a massive burden.
Exactly. By granting a blanket exemption to large religious employers, the state shifted the entire cost of that religious accommodation onto the shoulders of the LGBTQ employees.
Wow, yeah.
Those workers are now left entirely unprotected, legally vulnerable to being fired simply for being gay or transgender, just so the massive religious employer can avoid a burden.
That's a huge shift.
The author argues that in employment, exemptions shouldn't be blanket passes. They should be finely tailored, perhaps limited only to roles that are essential to the group's religious mission.
Which brings up a perfect test case. The San Francisco Catholic teachers.
Oh, this is a tough one.
This is where the rubber meets the road on defining essential roles.
Right. You had Catholic school teachers in San Francisco who found themselves facing termination not for what they taught in the classroom, but for their public speech outside of work.
What were they doing?
Specifically, they were posting support for same-sex marriage on social media platforms like Facebook.
So they aren't theology teachers openly defying church doctrine during a lecture. They are lay teachers living their private lives, but the school argues their public statements violate the moral code they were required to uphold as representatives of the church.
Exactly.
How does social coherence resolve this?
We have to go back to our freedom of association tiers.
Right. Are these teachers ministers and policymakers in Tier 3, or are they just regular workers?
That's the question. If they are teaching math or secular history, how tightly is their role tethered to the church's core theology?
So what's the solution?
The author suggests a highly nuanced, fact-specific solution. Teachers of secular subjects should generally retain a right to engage in political or social speech outside the workplace, unless the school can prove that the specific speech directly and materially undermines the essential religious educational goals of the parochial school.
So it demands a much finer, more careful balancing act than a simple blanket right to fire anyone who disagrees.
Precisely.
It's all about precision. Which brings us to the ultimate test of precision, the public official.
Oh boy.
Let's talk about Kim Davis.
The Kim Davis case is perhaps the most visceral flashpoint of this entire debate.
Let's set the scene for anyone who doesn't remember. Kim Davis was a county clerk in Rowan County, Kentucky. After the Supreme Court legalized same-sex marriage in Obergefell, couples began arriving at her office to get their marriage licenses. Davis, citing her deeply held apostolic Christian beliefs, refused to issue licenses to any same-sex couple.
And it didn't stop there.
No, not only that, she ordered all her deputy clerks to refuse as well. It became a massive national standoff, with couples denied service, protests, and eventually Davis being briefly jailed for contempt of court.
It was a constitutional crisis in a microcosm. You have a public official, someone whose salary is paid by the taxpayers to execute the law of the land, demanding a religious accommodation to not do their specific job.
So under Tebbe's framework, can a public official ever get a religious accommodation to opt out of a duty?
The author's analysis here is incredibly precise. The answer is, yes, a public official theoretically can get an accommodation, but only if two incredibly strict, non-negotiable conditions are met.
Okay, if Kim Davis is going to get an accommodation, I'm guessing based on everything we've talked about with Principle 1, it has to mean she doesn't shift the burden onto the couple, right?
You nailed it.
Like, they can't be forced to wait 3 hours or drive to the next county just because she has a religious objection.
Exactly. Condition 1 is Principle 1, avoiding harm to others. The accommodation must cause absolutely zero material harm, delay, or indignity to the citizens seeking the license.
Right.
If Davis's refusal forces a couple to travel, or wait unnecessarily, or hire a lawyer, that is an unconstitutional shifted burden. The citizens cannot pay the price for her conscience.
And Condition 2?
Condition 2 is Principle 4, government non-endorsement. The accommodation must create zero expressive harm.
Meaning she can't make a scene.
Exactly. If Kim Davis stands at the front counter of the municipal building, loudly denying the license and turning the county clerk's office into a taxpayer-funded billboard for religious disapproval of same-sex marriage, that is blatant, unconstitutional government endorsement of inequality.
It degrades the couple's citizenship.
Completely.
So given those two massive hurdles, how could she possibly have been accommodated legally? Is there a scenario where it works?
The author suggests a very narrow backroom accommodation.
How does that work?
Imagine Kim Davis has a quiet internal arrangement. When a same-sex couple approaches the counter, Davis quietly steps into the back room.
Okay.
A deputy clerk seamlessly steps forward, greets the couple respectfully, and issues the license without Davis's name or signature on it.
The couple experiences no delay.
Then,
They experience no visible disapproval or humiliation. They get exactly what they came for, with full, equal dignity.
in that highly specific scenario, that might be a permissible accommodation. It protects her internal conscience without shifting any material harm or expressive harm onto the citizens.
But the moment her religious objection spills over the counter and impacts the citizens' equal access or equal standing in the community, the accommodation must fail.
Right. She has to do her job or resign.
That is the razor-thin needle that public accommodations must thread.
It really is.
Okay, let's move to our final massive application area. We've talked about what the government regulates in the marketplace and how it handles its own employees. Now let's talk about what the government buys.
Application 3, government funding and subsidies.
Can the government pull funding from religious groups that discriminate?
This issue is a source of immense existential anxiety for religious traditionalists right now.
I can imagine.
Many religious institutions, colleges, charities, adoption agencies rely heavily on federal grants, state funding, or their tax-exempt status to survive.
Right.
They are terrified that if they refuse to conform to new LGBTQ equality laws, the government will bankrupt them by pulling their funding.
And this fear isn't unfounded, because there's a massive historical precedent for this.
There is.
The paradigm case the author brings up is Bob Jones University.
This is a foundational case for understanding government subsidies. In the 1970s, the IRS implemented a policy stating that it would no longer grant tax-exempt status to private schools that engaged in racial discrimination. Bob Jones University, a fundamentalist Christian university in South Carolina, had policies that strictly prohibited interracial dating and marriage among its students, based entirely on their interpretation of the Bible.
And the IRS revoked their tax-exempt status.
Yes, the university sued, claiming this was a catastrophic violation of their First Amendment right to free exercise of religion.
And what happened?
The case went all the way to the Supreme Court in 1983, and the court ruled against the university. They upheld the IRS's decision to pull the tax exemption.
The government essentially said, we acknowledge that your policies are rooted in sincere religious belief, but we are not going to subsidize those beliefs with taxpayer dollars.
Exactly. And the source text uses this case to draw a vital, sharp distinction between defunding an institution and banning an institution.
Let's explore that distinction because it's everything.
The government cannot ban Bob Jones University from existing. If Congress passed a law saying it is illegal to operate a school with these religious beliefs, and if you try, we will arrest you, that would be a flagrant violation of free exercise.
But a tax exemption is not a right to exist. It's a financial benefit.
Right. The government has broad, sweeping, constitutionally granted discretion over how it spends taxpayer dollars. It can choose to use its purse strings to promote certain public policies like racial equality or LGBTQ equality, and it can choose not to subsidize practices that run counter to those policies.
Which brings us to the modern equivalent of this debate. Faith-based organizations or FBOs.
This is a huge battleground today. The federal government gives billions of dollars in grants to faith-based organizations to provide social services.
Like what?
Running homeless shelters, managing foster care and adoption networks, providing aid to unaccompanied migrant minors.
But what happens when an FBO taking federal money refuses to hire an LGBTQ person or refuses to place a foster child with a same-sex couple, citing their religious values?
That is the exact tension. And under TEBI's framework, applying the principles we've discussed, if the government decides it wants to use its funding power to promote egalitarianism, say, by placing a condition on all federal contracts that the organization must agree to non-discrimination clauses, it is generally well within its constitutional rights to deny grants to religious groups that refuse to sign.
Just to put a fine point on it for anyone listening, just because you have a constitutional right to exercise your religion freely, it does not mean the government is constitutionally obligated to write you a check to help you do it.
Precisely. The state is not forcing the Catholic Adoption Agency to change its theology regarding marriage. The state is simply choosing what practices it will endorse and subsidize with public funds.
Right.
If an organization wants to discriminate based on its theology, it is free to do so on its own dime. But it cannot demand the taxpayers foot the bill.
We have covered an immense amount of legal and philosophical ground today.
We really have.
Let's try to bring this massive symphony to a close, synthesize the journey we've just been on.
If we step back and look at the landscape we started in, it was defined by bitter, seemingly intractable cultural warfare.
Very bitter.
We had two fundamental rights, religion and equality, locked in a deathmatch. The skeptics told us that finding a principled legal solution was impossible. The judges were just making things up, and that our civil rights were just subject to the raw, brute force of political majorities.
But the framework we explored today rejects that despair.
It does. Nelson Tebi's Religious Freedom in an Egalitarian Age offers a way out of the chaos.
How so?
Through the Ralston method of social coherence, we learn that we don't have to invent new laws out of thin air. We can look to our past, to the precedents we already trust, and test them.
Right.
We can use existing legal anchors, the principles of avoiding harm, fairness, freedom of association, and government non-endorsement to build a sturdy bridge.
And by carefully, meticulously applying those principles, we found that we can actually navigate the most explosive modern cases. From wedding vendors and school teachers to county clerks and government grants without tearing the Constitution apart.
Exactly.
And I think that points to the ultimate takeaway from this book and from our discussion today. You, listening right now, might passionately disagree with how the author resolves some of these cases.
That's totally fun.
You might think the wedding photographer should get the exemption or that Kim Davis was treated unfairly. And that is perfectly okay. Social coherence doesn't demand that we all reach the exact same final outcome on the first try.
But what it does demand, what is absolutely essential for the survival of a pluralistic constitutional democracy, is that we commit to arguing with reasons rather than just relying on tribal power.
Governing with reasons, even when it causes short-term anger, even when it involves a judge looking at one side and telling them they are legally wrong in a specific case, that is what creates a lasting, respectful political unity.
Right.
It proves that the law isn't just an arbitrary weapon wielded by the winners, it's a shared language that we all use to negotiate our lives together.
It's the profound difference between a society that just shouts at each other in the dark and a society that actively tries to sit down and tune its instruments to the same chord.
Which leaves me with a final, somewhat haunting question for you to mull over as you go about your day. It's a question that naturally arises from this framework, but one the text doesn't explicitly resolve.
Okay.
We've established that social coherence works by relying on our society having a foundation of shared values and trusted precedents to find harmony.
Right.
But look around at the political polarization today. What happens in a future where our society becomes so completely, totally fractured that we no longer share any baseline values?
Wow. Yeah.
How do you tune your instrument if every single person in the orchestra is reading off a completely different piece of sheet music?
That is the existential question that the next generation of judges, lawmakers, and citizens will have to answer.
Thank you so much for joining us on this incredibly complex deep dive into the source material. We'll see you next time.